Before the first sword was drawn, before the first archer pulled back his longbow, England was a land divided, not only by class and region, but by the invisible threads of borrowed culture and uncertain voice. She had kings, but not yet a clear identity. She had glory, but it was still measured in French titles and foreign ambition. She bore the scars of conquest, Norman blood in her crown, French words in her court, Latin prayers in her churches. The land was English, but the soul had yet to declare itself. And then came the 100 Years' War. What began as a dynastic quarrel over thrones and treaties would grow into something far greater. A crucible of identity, a trial of memory, a century-long storm that would batter England until she no longer resembled the kingdom that had begun it. These were not simply years of battle, they were years of becoming. It was through defeat that she learned resilience, through resistance that she discovered her strength, and through loss that she found what was truly hers. This is the story of how England became England. Part 1 laid the foundation, charting the sparks that ignited the war and the political fault lines that split a continent. Part 2 traced the psychological divide, how war sharpened the line between English and French, turning neighbors into others and shaping the first stirrings of national feeling. Part 3 followed the rebirth of the English tongue, as the common voice rose from the shadows of Latin and French to become the soul of a people. Part 4 honored the rise of the common soldier, the longbowman who stood in the mud and rewrote the rules of battle, proving that history is not made by nobility alone. And now, Part 5 asks the most important question. What was left when the war was over? No crown was won. No empire secured. But something had shifted forever. England emerged from the 100 Years' War with less land but more self, with a clearer language, a stronger people, and a story to call her own. This is not the tale of conquest. This is the tale of identity forged in fire. A nation that did not find herself by expanding outward, but by looking inward and rising, bloodied, broken, but reborn. But while England was on the path to finding herself, across the Channel, France was unraveling. Not through war, but through silence. A silence left by a king's final breath, and a crown with no rightful head to wear it. The death of a king. And the crown left unclaimed. In the early spring of 1328, the bells of Notre Dame tolled not in triumph, but in mourning. King Charles IV of France, last son of the mighty Philip IV, had died without leaving behind a male heir. With his passing, the direct Capetian line, unbroken for over 3 centuries, came to a silent and uneasy end. The throne of France, sacred and symbolic, now stood without a crowned head, and in that void rose questions that would shake the very foundation of European order. For in the game of kings, death was never the end. It was a summons to ambition. 3 times in succession, France had buried its kings without producing a surviving male heir. First Louis V, then Philip V, and now Charles IV. While the first 2 had sidestepped disaster through regency and political maneuvering, the third left no such chance. He left behind only a pregnant wife, Queen Jeanne of Evreux. And when her child was born a daughter, the realm was left exposed, leaderless, vulnerable. But in the medieval world, blood was power, and bloodlines were weapons. There were many who claimed a right to the throne, but only one who carried the royal Capetian blood from both sides of the Channel. That man was Edward III, King of England. A claim forged in royal blood. Edward was no mere opportunist. He was the grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother, Isabella of France, who was the only surviving daughter of the late French king. Through her, Edward claimed a direct link to the Capetian line, a link older and arguably stronger than that of any other claimant. His case was not based on ambition alone. It was built on lineage, legitimacy, and law. But France would not bend. The French nobility, wary of English power and fearful of foreign domination, rallied behind a different name, Philip of Valois, cousin to the late king, a member of the royal family, but not of the direct line. His claim was through the male line, more distant, but more convenient to those who wished to keep the crown firmly on French soil. To justify their choice, the French lords invoked a long, silent, and controversial clause of Frankish tradition, the Salic law. According to this ancient law, half memory, half myth, a woman could not inherit the French crown, nor could her sons claim it through her. It was a convenient shield. The law had rarely, if ever, been enforced to such extent before. But now, faced with the prospect of a foreign king ruling over the heart of France, the nobility wielded the Salic law like a sword. And so, Philip of Valois was crowned Philip VI of France. Betrayal in the blood. To the French, it was a safeguard against foreign influence. To the English, it was a calculated betrayal. And to Edward III, it was nothing less than a theft of his divine right. He was just 15 at the time. His crown still rested heavy on his youthful brow. His rule, dominated by the influence of his mother and her lover, Roger Mortimer, was weak and uncertain. But in the quiet of his chambers, beneath the weight of dynasties and shadows of monarchs past, a fire began to burn. Edward did not forget. He watched. He waited. And he understood something that would define his reign. Thrones are not taken through parchment. They are claimed through steel. A storm awakens. The seeds of the 100 Years' War were sown not in the fields of battle, but in the succession halls of Paris, in the whispering galleries of nobles, and in the bloodlines of monarchs long dead. The death of Charles IV did not simply end a dynasty. It lit the fuse for a war that would span 5 generations, 13 kings, and nearly every corner of Western Europe. Edward's claim had not died with the coronation of Philip VI. It had only been postponed, and in the years to come, that postponed claim would rise like a storm over France, carried on English ships, fired from longbows, and etched into the soul of a nation still waiting to be born. For this was no longer just about a crown. It was about honor. It was about legacy. It was about a king who would not kneel, and a nation that would rise with him. But the storm that had begun with the death of Charles IV did not pass. It gathered, darkened, and crept slowly across the channel, waiting for its herald. That herald came not from the sword, not yet, but from the veins of a king. For Edward III of England, the claim to the French throne was not built on ambition alone. It was woven into his very blood. And that blood ran through his mother, the formidable and controversial Isabella of France. Daughter of Philip IV, sister to 3 successive kings of France, Isabella was no common queen consort. She was royalty-born, raised in the shadow of Notre Dame, forged in the intrigues of the Capetian court. Her marriage to Edward II of England had been a political bridge between 2 kingdoms, but it had never softened her spirit. Known as the she-wolf of France, Isabella was shrewd, proud, and deeply aware of her lineage. And in the wake of her brother's death, she passed on not only blood to her son, but a cause. Bloodlines become battlegrounds. Edward III, barely more than a boy when Charles IV died, might have bowed in silence had he been born of lesser stock. But his mother's legacy was impossible to ignore. She was the sister of kings, the last living child of Philip IV. Through her, Edward inherited a direct link to the Capetian bloodline, closer by birth than Philip of Valois, whose claim would be crowned by political convenience rather than dynastic clarity. The laws of feudal Europe were twisted things, more shield than truth. And so, to deny Edward's claim, the French nobility resurrected the Salic law, that ancient Frankish principle that denied inheritance through the female line. It was a law long dormant, a whisper from a forgotten age, suddenly wielded as iron logic. But Edward saw through the veil. This was no defense of tradition. It was a political rejection, a calculated strike against his crown, and a denial of his birthright. If he allowed this to stand, if he let his claim fade quietly into the parchment of lost titles, England itself would be diminished. And so, beneath the weight of generations, Edward made his stand. From vassal to rival, still young but no longer passive, Edward III began to shape his destiny with the steel of will and the resolve of ancestry. The insult of homage in 1329, when he was forced to kneel before Philip VI for his French lands, had never healed. He had bent, but he had not broken. And now he would bend no more. He began to quietly assert his rights. Diplomats were dispatched, alliances forged in Flanders, Gascony strengthened. The churning seas of European politics began to turn in his favor. Philip VI, sensing the winds shift, responded with pressure and threats. He seized the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1337, an act of aggression, an open challenge. To Edward, it was the final outrage. No longer would he be a duke, no longer would he be a vassal. He would be a king, or he would be nothing. A king's bold proclamation. And so, in the winter of 1340, Edward III declared himself the rightful king of France. It was a thunderous act, not a whisper of diplomacy, but a roar of defiance. The royal seals of England were remade. The lilies of France were carved beside the lions of England. Banners stitched with both crests rose over castles and camps. This was no empty claim. It was a declaration of dynastic war, a challenge hurled into the heart of Paris. Edward had not merely invoked his mother's name. He had raised her blood like a standard in battle. To the French, it was blasphemy. To the English, it was justice. To Edward, it was destiny awakened. Thus, the war for the soul of two kingdoms had begun, not with cannon fire or clashing swords, but with a mother's blood, a son's defiance, and the rising cry of a king who would no longer be denied. And so, as Edward III raised his claim, clear and defiant, France responded not with diplomacy, but with doctrine. It was not the sword they reached for first, but the parchment. To deny the young English king, the French crown turned not to strength of lineage or to popular consent, but to an ancient law half buried in the memory of empire, the Salic law. It was a relic of the old Frankish kingdom, originally penned to determine land inheritance among warriors. But now, more than 8 centuries later, it would be twisted into a weapon of exclusion, a barrier not of reason, but of fear. For if Edward's claim were accepted, the Capetian realm would fall under the sway of a foreign sovereign. A king of England sitting on the throne of France was unthinkable to the proud nobility of Paris. And so, a legal fiction became royal policy. The law awakened. The argument was elegant in its simplicity. No woman could inherit the throne of France, and therefore no claim could pass through a woman. Edward's mother, Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, sister to 3 French kings, was now deemed legally irrelevant. The French court, desperate to preserve the realm's independence, declared that Edward's blood, though royal, was tainted by maternity. He was of the wrong gender, by the wrong parent, in the wrong land. Instead, the crown passed to Philip of Valois, a nephew of Philip IV through the male line. Though more distant by blood, he was French-born, French-speaking, and above all, French-controlled. His selection was not the result of destiny, but of design. He was the answer to a question France dared not answer honestly. And so in 1328, Philip VI was crowned King of France in Reims, the sacred site of coronation, amid the incense and chants of legitimacy. But beneath the velvet and the anointing oil, there was fear. Fear of England's response, fear of war, fear that the veil of law could not hide the truth of power denied. A kingdom's choice, a rival's resolve. France had made its decision. It had chosen law over blood, politics over legacy, security over unity. But in choosing Philip, it had also chosen its adversary. To Edward III, this was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a betrayal, a deliberate exclusion from what was rightfully his, wrapped in the ceremonial robes of justice. The French lords had not merely rejected his claim, they had rejected the very bloodline from which it sprang. He saw in their legal maneuver not tradition, but cowardice, not law, but the barricade of fear. And fear, Edward knew, was something he could use. The fault line of Europe. With 2 crowns claimed and 1 throne contested, Europe itself began to tremble. The great fault line had formed, not only between Edward and Philip, but between 2 visions of monarchy. One built upon inheritance and right, ancient and unbroken. The other built upon law, convenience, and political necessity. The Salic law, once obscure, had become a wall that split not just kingdoms, but history itself. France, in securing its independence from England, had ignited a war that would rage for a century. In choosing Philip VI, it had also chosen its fate. And so, the stage was set. 2 kings, 1 crown, and a continent preparing to burn. The coronation of Philip VI had not ended the crisis. It had only postponed the reckoning, for the crown was only the symbol. The true fire smoldered in the soil, and that soil stretched across the fields of Aquitaine and the markets of Flanders, lands caught between kings, torn by fealty and trade, identity and survival. Edward III, though denied the French crown, still held title to a vast portion of French territory. The Duchy of Aquitaine, a jewel in the southwest of France, remained under English control since the days of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. But Edward did not rule it as an equal. He ruled it as a vassal, a subordinate to Philip VI, the very man who had stolen his throne. It was a humiliation cloaked in legality, and Edward bore it like a chain around his neck. Aquitaine. A crown's wound. Aquitaine was more than land. It was a symbol of all that was broken between the 2 kingdoms. The English king was expected to pay homage to the French king for this territory, to kneel before a man he believed had usurped his divine right. Edward did pay that homage in 1329, under pressure and unrest. But his bow was not one of loyalty. It was a wound, barely concealed beneath the folds of ceremony. To kneel before Philip was to accept his rule, and to accept his rule was to deny his own blood. As tensions mounted, both sides accused the other of violations. Smugglers arrested, towns seized, laws rewritten, insults exchanged. Aquitaine became a chessboard of grievances, every move watched with suspicion, every gesture seen as a threat. The French crown, emboldened by its legal victory, began to tighten control over Aquitaine, claiming new jurisdictions, threatening confiscation, and treating Edward more as a rebellious tenant than a sovereign prince. It was not governance. It was provocation. Flanders. The merchant battlefield. But the heart of tension did not lie only in the warm vineyards of Aquitaine. It beat just as fiercely in the icy winds of Flanders, a region economically bound to England and politically tangled with France. Flemish merchants depended on English wool as their lifeblood. The English depended on Flemish looms to weave their prosperity. But Flanders, nominally under French suzerainty, was a battleground of loyalty. Its cities leaned toward England for trade. Its counts leaned toward France for survival. Philip VI sought to assert control, attempting to choke English influence by disrupting trade. In response, Edward courted the powerful merchants of Ghent and Bruges, weaving a new kind of alliance, one of coin and cloth, not crowns. Flanders became a stage where kings fought not with armies but with embargoes, bribes, and rebellions. Philip's interference was met with riots. Edward's gold bought loyalty, and beneath it all, a fragile network of loyalties trembled on the edge of collapse. A powder keg of pride. Neither king could back down. Philip, the newly crowned monarch, could not allow his vassal to act like an equal. Edward, the wounded claimant, could not endure the humiliation of bowing to the man who sat on his throne. Every town seized, every tax disputed, every ambassador recalled, was one step closer to war. The conflict was no longer a question of legitimacy or inheritance. It was a question of honor, of control, of the right to command not only lands and lords, but the very future of Western Christendom. The air between the two realms thickened, not with words, but with steel unspoken. The rift deepens. By 1337, the cracks had become chasms. Philip VI, declaring Edward unfaithful in his duties as vassal, officially confiscated Aquitaine, stripping the English king of his lands in France. It was the final insult, a gesture that shattered all pretense of peace. And Edward, at last, let the mask fall. No more diplomacy, no more homage, no more silence. If France would not yield the crown by blood, then England would take it by war. The confiscation of Aquitaine was not merely an act of sovereignty, it was a declaration of contempt. By seizing Edward's lands in France, Philip VI had cast aside the last veil of diplomacy. He had dared to humiliate the King of England on the international stage, declaring him a disobedient vassal unworthy of title or land. But in doing so, Philip had miscalculated. He had forgotten that Edward was no longer the boy who had once knelt at Amiens. He was now a king grown bold, a monarch hardened by betrayal, a warrior sharpening his crown into a blade. The last bow has been drawn. When news of the confiscation reached Westminster, it was met not with fear, but with fury. Edward gathered his lords and councillors and pronounced at last what had long burned in his soul. The realm of France is mine by blood, not by favor. If it will not be given, then it shall be taken. No longer would he bow. No longer would he plead. The age of appeasement had ended. What began as a legal insult had now become a matter of national pride, of royal defiance, and of divine justice. The heralds were sent. Alliances, carefully nurtured in the Low Countries, were awakened. Letters were dispatched to the Pope and to the courts of Europe. The banners of war began to rise. The Lion and the Lilies. In October 1337, Edward III formally declared war on France, proclaiming himself the rightful king of France and sovereign over its lands. This was not merely an act of rebellion, it was a cosmic claim, a royal judgment that he, not Philip, carried the mantle of Charlemagne and the House of Capet. From the towers of English castles to the docks of Bordeaux and Bruges, the news spread like wildfire. England would fight not to defend, but to claim. The heraldry of the realm changed. Where once flew the red lions of England alone, now came the fleur-de-lis of France, stitched side by side, a symbol of dual kingship, of ambition unbound. This was no mere border dispute, it was a battle for the soul of two kingdoms. The forge of destiny. Edward's declaration echoed beyond the walls of palaces. In the hearts of knights and commoners alike, a sense of destiny stirred. For the first time in generations, the English crown stood for something greater than feudal politics. It stood for a righteous cause, a challenge hurled at the highest throne of Europe. Recruitment swelled, ports bristled with ships, smiths beat swords with reverence. From Gascony to Calais, the world braced for thunder. Philip, too, answered the call. France summoned her armies, rallied her nobles, and swore that the English claim would be buried in French soil. But beneath his armor, the new king knew this was no ordinary war. He was not facing a rebellious vassal. He was facing a rival monarch, crowned by conviction and anointed by blood. A war without end. Thus, with crowns divided and thrones contested, the first sparks flew across the Channel. What followed would not be a swift campaign, nor a single battle of kings. It would become a war of generations, of sons avenging fathers, of empires collapsing and identities forged anew. The 100 Years' War had begun, and with it the old world of chivalry, inheritance, and divine right would be forever transformed. In the fields of France and the hearts of England, a new chapter opened, written not in ink, but in iron, fire, and the roar of banners rising against the wind. But not all wars are fought with steel. Even as knights clashed and kingdoms bled, a quieter battle raged within, the battle for England's very voice. A kingdom divided by its tongue. Though war had now begun in earnest, blades drawn, banners lifted, it was not on the battlefield alone that the struggle unfolded. For long before English arrows darkened French skies, another war had simmered in silence. A war of language, a war of soul. In the early days of the 100 Years' War, the English were not yet truly English. Not in speech, not in mind, not even in the mirror of their own culture. The nobility of England, from lords in their castles to judges in their courts, spoke not the tongue of the common folk, but the polished aristocratic syllables of Norman French. Latin ruled the church and law, French governed diplomacy and power, and English, rough, rural, and unrefined, was the language of villagers, peasants, and silence. It had been so since 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed the sea and planted his sword in Saxon soil. In the centuries that followed, the conqueror's tongue became the voice of kings, and the native speech of the island was shoved into the shadows. Lords without a country. The English court in the 14th century resembled a transplanted Paris more than an independent realm. Noble children were raised with French tutors. Literature and poetry were imported from the continent. The ideals of chivalry, courtly love, and knighthood were copied directly from the chansons of France. The very identity of the ruling class had been foreign for generations. They dressed in French fashion, wrote in French script, dreamed in French dreams. Even the king himself, Edward III, grew up speaking French as his first language. It was a strange irony. As he prepared to challenge the throne of France by right of blood, he did so in the very language of his enemy. But Edward was not alone in this paradox. His entire kingdom stood upon divided ground, its body in England, its soul across the Channel. The awakening beneath. And yet, in the shadow of castles and beneath the silence of the plow, something ancient stirred. The common folk, long ignored by chroniclers and courts, had never surrendered their tongue. They spoke Middle English, a fusion of Anglo-Saxon roots and Norman grafts, battered by centuries but still breathing. Their songs, prayers, and curses were not spoken in French. Their griefs, their joys, their labor, none of it required a court poet. And now, with war on the wind, the needs of the realm changed. England could no longer rely solely on its nobles and knights. It needed soldiers, archers, laborers, a nation to rise, not a class. And so, the forgotten tongue of the fields began to echo louder in the halls of war. The war that changed their voice. As English soldiers marched into France to fight their supposed cultural cousins, they did not feel brotherhood. They felt difference. The French mocked their accents, sneered at their rough manners, dismissed them as barbarians. And in that ridicule, the English saw a reflection. They were not French. They were something else, something separate, something forming. What had once been shame began to twist into pride. What had once been foreign began to feel false. And what had once been ignored, the English language, the English mind, the English soul, began to rise. The war had begun as a matter of thrones and treaties, but in the hearts of the people, it was becoming a matter of identity. And identity, once awakened, does not sleep again. From the fields of Aquitaine to the gates of Calais, war had drawn sword against sword, but beneath the armor, something deeper was forming. For centuries, the ruling houses of England and France had been bound by blood, marriage, language, and law. Their nobility shared common ancestors. Their courts shared customs. Their sons trained side by side in the arts of war and diplomacy. But as English soldiers marched through French soil under banners claiming a stolen crown, the illusion of brotherhood began to crumble. The French were no longer kin. They were no longer rivals. They were the other. The mirror shattered. In the earliest campaigns of the war, English troops, many of them commoners drawn from the shires and hills of England, expected to find a land not unlike their own. Their leaders spoke the same language as the enemy. Their laws bore the same Latin roots. Their nobility shared surnames and lineages that stretched across the sea. But what they encountered was not recognition. It was rejection. The French scorned them, not just as enemies, but as lesser men, as crude islanders whose manners stank of smoke and mud. The English tongue was mocked as harsh and unrefined. Their food, their dress, their customs, all were met with disdain. What the French saw was barbarism. What the English felt was contempt. And in that wound, something hardened. They no longer saw the French as distant cousins with a disputed crown. They saw them as arrogant, decadent, false, a people who had long forgotten the weight of real labor, real grit, and real loyalty. The birth of the enemy. Thus was born the idea of the foreign French, not just a rival kingdom, but a nation fundamentally different in character, in culture, in soul. To the English, France became the mirror that revealed who they were not. The French rode with banners of gold and embroidered saints. The English marched with mud-stained boots and longbows carved from yew. Oh, the French glorified the ceremony of war. The English exalted the effectiveness of it. The French believed honor lived in ancestry. The English began to believe it lived in action. The chivalric myths of shared nobility died in the fields of Brittany and the smoke of pillaged towns. Where once had stood two houses of one empire, now stood two peoples, forged in opposition. An identity carved in war. This growing sense of us and them was not abstract. It was hammered into the minds of soldiers by fire and blood. Every skirmish reinforced it. Every insult deepened it. Every victory confirmed it. The French, so proud of their lineage, were now seen as soft, deceitful, and faithless. The English, long scorned as crude and unworthy, now saw themselves as the heirs to a new kind of strength, earned, not inherited. And this shift did not stop at the battlefield. It crept into song, into poetry, into the tales told in taverns and around winter hearths. The Frenchman became the villain of the national story, the enemy of English virtue, the foil to English honor. The line drawn. In truth, the differences between the two peoples had long existed. But war gave them meaning. War gave them weight. War gave them voice. By fighting the French, the English had begun to discover themselves. Not through treaties, not through bloodlines, but through resistance. And so, the war that had begun as a royal dispute was now becoming a crucible of identity. England was no longer a shadow of France. It was becoming its opposite. By now, the swords had struck deep, and the banners of both kingdoms were torn by wind and fire. But the most lasting wound of this long war was not found in the flesh. It was carved in the mind. What had once been two crowns bound by blood and custom now stood as opposites, divided not only by armies, but by identity. The fields of France had become more than battlegrounds. They had become mirrors. And in those mirrors the English saw what they were not, and began to grasp what they truly were. The transformation had begun. A war that redefined kinship. In centuries past, France and England had been intertwined. The Norman invasion had bound them. The Angevin Empire had overlapped them. Their nobility intermarried. Their clergy studied the same Latin texts, and their knights upheld the same chivalric codes. But war unraveled those ties thread by thread. With every French noble who scorned the English tongue, with every village raised in Gascony, with every bitter campaign fought in lands once shared, The illusion of kinship dissolved. No longer were they cousins quarreling over inheritance. They were strangers, fighting over the right to define the future of Europe. Borders without maps. And so a new kind of boundary began to emerge, not drawn on parchment but etched in belief. It was a psychological border, intangible yet undeniable, a frontier of perception, loyalty, and self-understanding. To be English was now to be not French. To be French was to be the enemy. To cross from one to the other was not a step. It was a betrayal. This border was fortified not by stone, but by story. The songs sung in English taverns no longer romanticized French knights, but ridiculed them. The sermons in English churches painted France as Babylon, a land of corruption and false kings. Even children grew up knowing the word Frenchman not as a neighbor, but as a warning. It was the kind of border that outlasts treaties, the kind that endures long after the war is done. A kingdom begins to dream of itself. As the war dragged on, decade after decade, England began to see itself not as a shadow of France, but as a nation apart. This shift was subtle, yet seismic. Parliament began to speak more often in English than in Latin. And chronicles once written for foreign courts began to celebrate native victories. The English soldier, once nameless beneath the banner of a French-speaking king, now became a symbol of defiance, skill, and common strength. Even the longbow, wielded by peasants and feared by knights, became a kind of national icon, proof that the soul of England lay not in courtly refinement, but in rugged resolve. The war did not just forge heroes, it forged a people. From King's War to People's War. In the beginning, the 100 Years' War was a feud of nobles, a dynastic quarrel wrapped in silk and gold. But as years turned into generations and boys became fathers of fallen sons, the war became personal. It bled into the homes of blacksmiths and shepherds, into the prayers of widows and the songs of orphans. It became England's war, and France was no longer a royal opponent. It was the other, against which Englishness could finally take shape, the birth of a line that could not be undrawn. Thus, in the crucible of blood and language, raids and resistance, a psychological border emerged, unseen but powerful. Where once the Channel was a waterway between rulers, now it was a gulf between nations. Not merely England and France, but English and French. Two peoples, two minds, two destinies. As the psychological border between England and France deepened, it did more than divide, it defined. What had begun as a royal feud, a quarrel of dynasties, was now something far greater. It was becoming a national awakening. The war, long and merciless, had burned away illusions, had stripped kingdoms of their borrowed robes and forced peoples to see themselves clearly, brutally, proudly, unflinchingly. And within that crucible, a new spirit was rising. A spirit not born of treaties or thrones, but of toil and blood and stubborn pride. It was not yet called nationalism, but it was something older, deeper. It was called belonging. From court to field. The threads of identity. Once, only kings and lords had the luxury of identity. Commoners served. Nobles ruled. The realm belonged to the crown. But war cares nothing for hierarchy. It demands from everyone. Taxes from the poor. Sons from the hearth. Courage from the desperate. And so, as longbowmen bled beside knights, and villagers fed armies marching to distant fields, something unexpected occurred. The boundaries between classes blurred, if only for a moment, and in that moment, they saw each other. The noble who once spoke only French now rallied troops in English. The common soldier who once fought for bread now fought for home. and the peasant who once feared the law now bore arms in the name of the realm. Each man came to see himself not just as subject to a king, but as part of something larger. Something called England. The soldier as symbol. It was on the battlefield, above all, that this new Englishness took shape. The victories at Crécy and Poitiers were not only military triumphs, they were cultural revelations. There, the pride of France had been shattered not by armored knights, but by yeomen with longbows, sons of farmers and shepherds who had risen from obscurity to make kings kneel. These were not elite warriors born to glory. They were the sons of England, and their arrows carried not just death, but identity. Each shot that felled a French nobleman declared, "This is who we are, and we are not like you." The longbow became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of English spirit, simple, strong, and devastatingly effective. A shared language of belonging. As the war raged on, English speech itself became a banner. No longer confined to taverns and fields, it crept into law, into chronicles, into the royal court. By the late 14th century, Parliament was conducted in English. Royal proclamations were issued in English, and poets like Chaucer gave voice to the people in a tongue that once had no place in literature. From the noble to the merchant, from the archer to the plowman, a common thread was being woven. They began to speak the same language. They began to tell the same story, and in doing so they began to realize they belonged to the same land, not just as tenants or servants, but as a people. The crown, below the crown. Even as the war wore on, through famine, through plague, through betrayal, this sense of Englishness endured. It was not perfect. It was not pure. But it was real. It lived in the pride of archers returning home. It burned in the poems of clerks and the ballads of minstrels. It whispered in village markets and echoed in London halls. It was the crown beneath the crown, not made of gold, but of shared struggle and stubborn survival. Becoming England. The 100 Years' War had torn two kingdoms apart, but in doing so, it had drawn one people together. They had fought side by side. They had suffered side by side, and in the ashes of war, they had begun to dream side by side, not of conquest, not of glory, but of something more enduring. A land they could finally call their own. A name they could finally speak with pride. A people becoming English. And so, as blood soaked the soil of distant fields, as towns rose and fell beneath the banners of rival kings, England did not simply fight a foreign war. It gazed into a mirror forged by fire. This mirror did not show crowns or castles. It did not reflect treaties or lineages. It showed a people, raw, weathered, awakening. For war, relentless and indifferent, has one hidden gift. It strips away illusion. It reveals what survives. And what survived in England was not the borrowed elegance of French courts, nor the echoes of Norman heritage. What survived was something native, rising from the land itself. A language, a pride, a people. The mirror of the battlefield. On the battlefields of France, the English came face to face with themselves, not as nobles or peasants, but as a collective force, shaped by shared struggle. When a common archer brought down a noble knight, the old feudal world trembled. When the king addressed his soldiers in English, the ancient walls between ruler and ruled cracked. They saw it in each other's faces, in the mud, in the blood, in the silence before the charge. We are not what we were told we are. We are something new. The enemy wore familiar armor, but the English soul had changed, hardened by distance, deepened by pain. And in contrast to the enemy, the English began to feel, not inferior, but distinct, the war that gave them shape. This war, though born of royal claim, had become a crucible of identity. It gave rise to the English language in court and parliament. It elevated the longbowman as a hero equal to the knight. It linked the fate of the realm not just to kings, but to every soul who bled for it. France had forced England to fight. But in doing so, France had forced England to define itself, not by what it borrowed, but by what it became. The end of the shadow. For centuries, England had lived in France's shadow. Its ruling class had mimicked French speech, adopted French culture, upheld French chivalry. But the war shattered that reflection. France was no longer a model to admire. It was a rival to resist. And resistance brought revelation. What once felt like imitation now felt like submission. And what once seemed foreign now felt false. The mirror revealed a truth that could no longer be unseen. We are not them. We are us. We are English. A people forged, not inherited. This new identity was not born in palaces. It was hammered out in the cries of the wounded, in the hunger of blockades, in the silent prayers of mothers awaiting sons who would not return. It did not arrive with flags. It rose from the ground, rough, stubborn, enduring. And though kings would change, borders would shift, and battles would rage for another century, the English people had found something permanent. Not victory, not conquest, themselves. The mirror stands. Still the war would go on. The swords would not yet rest. But the soul of England had been glimpsed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The mirror that war had raised would not break. It would stand, through plague and revolt, through dynasties and reformations, as a silent witness to a people who had finally met their own reflection. And in that reflection they saw not a copy of another land, but a nation in its own right, a voice rising from within. A kingdom becoming England. But before that voice could rise, before the people could speak their truth in the tongue of their own soil, they lived in a kingdom where words were borrowed and silence was law. Tongues of empire. Before English had a voice. Before the fire of war lit the soul of England, before archers carved their names into history, before the language of the common folk dared enter the halls of kings, there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of suppression. In the centuries leading up to the 100 Years' War, England was ruled not only by monarchs, but by foreign tongues. Words held power, and power belonged to Latin and French, the twin tongues of the elite. Latin was the language of law, of scripture, of God. It echoed in cathedral choirs, flowed from the pens of scribes, and governed the minds of judges and priests. It was the voice of eternity, unchanging, unreachable, incomprehensible to most. French, meanwhile, ruled the courts. It danced through the halls of nobility, adorned legal documents, and sang the ballads of kings and queens. Since the Norman conquest in 1066, Norman French had become the language of status, elegance, and authority. To speak French was to belong, to be heard. The English kings themselves, Plantagenets, Angevins, and early Lancastrians, spoke French as their first tongue, addressed Parliament through interpreters, and composed poetry in the words of Paris, not London. To rise in power was to rise in language, and English was not the latter. English, the forgotten tongue. Down in the villages and towns, in the stables and smithies, the people still spoke English. But it was a language exiled within its own land. It had no place in Parliament, no seat in university halls, no glory in literature, no sacredness in the church. To speak English was to speak from the margins. It was the language of mothers and merchants, of weathered hands and untaught minds. It carried memory, yes, but not might. Even the very laws that governed the English were written in French, delivered in Latin, and enforced by men who saw English as little more than a crude dialect of the soil. It was as if the soul of the nation had been split from its tongue. The silence of kings. Perhaps no moment captured this more than the early reigns of English monarchs who could barely speak the language of their own people. Henry III composed letters to the Pope in flawless Latin, but relied on translators to address his subjects. Edward I, though fiercely English in warfare, used French almost exclusively in court. Even Edward III, the very king who would later raise the banner against France, grew up speaking French in palace halls, while the language of the streets remained foreign to his ears. This was the England of old, a kingdom whose crown rested in English soil, but whose words were spoken in borrowed voices. A nation mute in its own song. And yet, beneath this elegant domination, something stirred. The people did not forget their tongue. They whispered it in marketplaces. They taught it to their children. They carved it into oak beams and stone walls. They buried their dead with it and sang to their newborns in it. It survived. But survival is not the same as power. And before the war, English was not yet a force. It was a ghost, present but unseen, heard but unheard, waiting for a reckoning. The stage before the uprising. So when the war came, it did not only bring swords and siege towers. It brought opportunity. Opportunity for a language long silenced to find its voice, for a people long divided to speak in unity, for the mother tongue of England to rise, not as an echo, but as a standard. Before that could happen, though, the people needed a reason, a war, a fire, a cause worthy of a voice. And that voice was coming. The silence was breaking. What Latin had buried in parchment, and French had crowned in silk, was now rising from the dust and blood of war, not with elegance, but with purpose. The English language, long banished to the hearth and the hedgerow, now marched with the army, shouted from siege towers, and echoed in victory. It came not from kings, not from bishops, but from the mouths of those who fought, bled, and buried their dead with calloused hands. The people had found their war, and with it, they began to find their voice. The language of the archer. The longbowman did not speak Latin. The farmer turned soldier did not quote Cicero. The blacksmith who became a captain could not write in French, but they could strike fear across the fields of Crécy and Poitiers. They could humble knights with a single arrow. They could break siege lines with stubborn courage and iron faith, and they did it all in English. As England's military strength shifted from noble cavalry to common infantry, so too did the cultural balance begin to tip. The men who bore the weight of England's war no longer came from castles, but from cottages, from alehouses, from the villages that dotted the green bones of the island. Their voices mattered, because their lives were now the shield of the kingdom. From margins to center. At first, the noble class still held the pen. French remained the language of command. Latin remained the voice of judgment. But war is a patient reformer, and blood is a persuasive ink. The more soldiers returned from war with honor, scarred, victorious, and loyal, the more they demanded to be heard. The more peasants bore taxes to fund the crown's ambitions, the more they demanded representation. The more villages sent sons to die in France, the more they demanded to speak in the language of their grief. Parliament, once dominated by Latin legalese and French flourish, began to shift. By the mid-14th century, English, not French, was increasingly spoken within its chambers, not because it was fashionable, but because it was necessary. A king could not rule without soldiers, and soldiers could not be ruled without language. The tongue of the realm. And so, the unthinkable began. The English tongue crept upward. It was used in battlefield commands. It was etched into letters sent home from campaign. It became the language of recruitment, of prayer for the fallen, of folk songs sung to remember the lost. Even the church, once zealous in its defense of Latin as the only sacred tongue, found English creeping into sermons and confessions. The people would no longer beg forgiveness in a language they could not understand. They wanted to pray as they bled, in English. Power from the soil. The rise of English was not a revolution of grammar. It was a revolution of recognition. For centuries, power had spoken in borrowed voices. Now it began to echo with the cadence of the people who had tilled the soil, fed the armies, drawn the bows, and buried the dead. Their tongue was rough, yes, but it was real. It came not from courts, but from truth. And the realm was beginning to listen. The language of loyalty. To fight in a king's war was to suffer for the realm. But to fight in your own language, that was something new. It meant that the war was not just for crowns or coats of arms. It was for identity, for the right to be seen, heard, named. The common people had always borne the weight of England. Now, for the first time, they were beginning to shape it. And they would shape it in English. What began in the muddy fields of France soon thundered through the marble pillars of Parliament. The longbowman's voice, the one shouted across battle lines and whispered in prayer, was no longer content to echo only through village lanes and alehouses. It began to rise, slow and steady, into the sanctums of power. And for the first time in centuries, the great institutions of the realm, the church, the courts, and the crown, could no longer ignore the tongue they had long cast aside. The crown listens to its soldiers. The kings of England, though still draped in the trappings of French nobility, began to shift. Not out of sentiment, but out of survival. A king who expected his soldiers to die for him had to learn to speak to them. Not in the language of Paris, but in the words of the plowman, the archer, the smith. And so, English entered the court, not as a guest, but as a voice of loyalty. By the mid-14th century, Edward III had begun issuing proclamations in English. Not merely symbolic, these declarations carried legal weight and were meant to be understood by all, not just clerics and nobles. For the first time since 1066, the crown was addressing its realm in the language of the realm. The law speaks to the people. In the courts, too, a quiet revolution took root. Justice had long worn the mask of Latin, remote, mystical, alien. The people feared it, for they could not understand it. They obeyed it, but they never felt it was theirs. But war had changed that. The commoner who fought beside his lord on the battlefield now demanded to stand with him in court, not beneath. In 1362, Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading, declaring that English would be used in legal proceedings so that the people might understand the law that governed them. No longer would verdicts be handed down in cloaks of foreign speech. Now, the law would speak in the clear voice of the nation. The church hears the murmur. Even the church, fortress of Latin tradition and gatekeeper of salvation, began to feel the wind change. The war had shaken faith. Priests buried hundreds in a day. Chaplains marched with armies. Villagers watched plague and violence consume their world. In their desperation, the people turned not just to God, but to understanding. And understanding required language. They no longer wanted sermons muttered in Latin or prayers read from unreachable books. They wanted the word of God in their own tongue, the same tongue they used to mourn the dead and bless the harvest. The seeds were sown for what would one day become a translation of the Bible into English, a revolution that would shake the spiritual world just as war had shaken the political one. From whisper to thunder, what had once been a whisper of the commoner now became a roar of the nation. English in the court was now the language of justice. English in the crown was now the language of governance. English in the church was now the language of salvation. And through it all, one truth echoed louder than any decree. We are no longer ruled in a tongue we cannot speak. The voice of authority becomes native. With each law passed in English, each sermon spoken plainly, each royal order heard without translation, the realm was reforged. No longer was England simply ruled. Now it was represented, not just by blood or birth, but by language. The institutions that once spoke above the people now spoke with them, and the tongue that had once lived only in the shadow of cathedrals and castles now stood in their light. The law had begun to speak English. The crown had begun to command in English. The church had begun to pray in English. But still, something remained. A realm needs more than orders and prayers. It needs stories. A nation truly becomes itself when it can tell its own tale, in its own tongue, not merely to record law or plead justice, but to dream, to weep, to laugh, to remember. And so, from the very soil soaked with war and resurrection, arose voices, not of kings, but of poets. Voices that gave the English people a mirror, a melody, and a myth. Their names were Chaucer and Gower, and their words would awaken something that battle alone could not forge, a shared soul. The pen becomes a banner. Until now, the written word had belonged to the privileged. Latin was the language of the sacred. French was the language of courtly romance and scholarly wit. English had no place on the parchment of prestige, but the 100 Years' War had changed the balance of power. And where power flows, art soon follows. Geoffrey Chaucer, once a soldier and diplomat, turned his gaze inward, to the people. Not lords and ladies alone, but pilgrims, millers, wives, students, and merchants. In his hands, their voices were not mocked, but honored. In the Canterbury Tales, he wrote not in Latin for the learned, nor in French for the noble, but in English for the English. Not just any English, but living English, earthy, rhythmic, full of wit and wisdom, of scandal and sanctity. Through Chaucer the people saw themselves, flawed, noble, comical, and profound. Through his pen, the nation learned it could laugh in its own language, grieve in it, love in it. He did not simply write poetry, he wrote identity. Gower, the moral mirror. And alongside Chaucer stood John Gower, a poet of conscience, a man of 3 tongues, who chose English not because it was easy, but because it was needed. His Confessio Amantis, the lover's confession, written in elegant English verse, showed that the tongue of the common people could carry the weight of morality, philosophy, and classical tradition. No longer would English be confined to the marketplace. Now it could ponder the soul. Now it could tell of kings and gods and eternal truths. Through Gower, English became a language not just of power, but of virtue. From mouth to memory. The works of Chaucer and Gower did not spread because of court decree. They spread because they belonged to the people. Read aloud in taverns, quoted in guild halls, memorized by students, celebrated by clerks. They were not merely literature. They were scripture for the soul of a rising nation. And as their stories traveled, so too did a truth that no foreign tongue could erase. This is our language. These are our lives. This is our England. A nation begins to sing with poetry came permanence. For laws change, kings die, wars end, but stories, they endure. The English language, once laughed out of courtrooms and cloisters, now soared through the minds and hearts of an awakening people. It could tell the story of a knight's honor, a widow's sorrow, a peasant's prayer, a fool's wisdom. Through Chaucer and Gower, England did not just rise in arms. It rose in imagination. And when a nation begins to imagine itself in its own voice, there is no going back. From Chaucer's wit to Gower's wisdom, from the battlefield to the pulpit, the English language had proven its worth, not by royal decree, but by the heartbeat of a people awakening to themselves. No longer was English merely the language of the common folk. No longer was it confined to mud-slicked villages or whispered in market stalls. Now, it was the soul of a people made visible, a banner that flew not from a castle tower, but from every tongue that dared to speak with pride. A language, forged in fire. The 100 Years' War did more than redraw maps. It redrew the psyche of a nation, as English soldiers bled beside one another on foreign soil, as English families wept and prayed in the same familiar words, as English poets told tales in tones the people could feel. Something irreversible happened. The people began to see themselves not as fractured villages or feuding lords, but as one people, one land, one voice. And that voice was English. From identity to ideology, language is more than sound. It is memory, belief, and belonging. The rise of English was not just practical, it was spiritual. It carried the grief of widows, the valor of archers, the faith of mothers, the dreams of children. Through it, the English remembered their past, spoke their present, and began to shape their future. It gave them something France could never take, not land, not wealth, but selfhood. No longer the language of the poor. What once had been ridiculed as rustic and crude was now spoken in Parliament, written into law, sung in poetry, and prayed in cathedrals. What once had belonged only to the peasant now belonged to the crown, and more importantly, it belonged to all. In English, a nobleman and a farmer could understand one another. In English, a soldier and a priest could share a prayer. In English, a mother could teach her child both faith and pride. It was the great equalizer, the thread that wove together class, region, and role. The language of belonging. Across the realm, identity no longer depended solely on who your lord was, or what blood ran in your veins, or what lands you owned. It depended on what language you lived in. And if you lived in English, you were part of something vast, something sacred, something enduring. To speak English, they began to say, is not just to be understood, it is to belong. The war had created soldiers. The war had created widows. But most of all, the war had created Englishmen, not by birthright, but by voice, the sword and the word. By the late 14th century, the shift was complete. The battles had proven the strength of the common man. The poets had proven the soul of the common tongue. And the people had proven that unity could be forged not just by law or crown, but by language. A language that told the story of who they were. A language that no longer bowed to France. A language that no longer whispered in the shadows. English had risen, not as a dialect, but as a declaration. One realm, one voice. As the war raged on and kings changed and battles rose and fell, one truth endured. The people of England now had a voice of their own, a voice strong enough to carry loss, wise enough to shape law, beautiful enough to carry poetry, sacred enough to speak to God. And united in that voice, they were no longer just subjects. They were a nation. And yet, before that voice rose above the clash of kingdoms, before the language of the people echoed through courtrooms, churches, and songs, there was a time when war itself spoke only one tongue, the tongue of the noble. The age of iron and honor. When war belonged to nobles. Before the longbow sang. Before muddy boots trampled the pride of mounted lords. Before the name of the common man was etched into the scroll of war. Battle belonged to the few. War in the old world was not a burden shared by the nation. It was a privilege, reserved for the elite. In the centuries before the 100 Years' War, the battlefield was a stage of honor, not of necessity. Knighthood was not merely a rank, it was a performance, a dance of plumes and pageantry, of banners unfurled and lances poised. To die in war was noble, and to win in war was divine, but only if you wore a coat of arms, the theater of chivalry. These were the days when the sword was ceremonial, and the lance was the key to glory. Knights trained from childhood in the arts of war jousted in tournaments as if preparing for a play, not a campaign. Armor gleamed, trumpets sounded, and when they rode into battle, it was as if heaven had granted them wings. To fight was not merely to defend, it was to prove bloodline, to rise by merit of birth, not by courage, to win applause from courts, not from countrymen. And the battlefield reflected this aristocratic dream. It was a place of hierarchy, where commands flowed downward like divine will, and valor was measured in silken scars and mounted charges. The forgotten majority. And what of the rest? The blacksmith, who fashioned swords but was never meant to wield one. The shepherd, who guarded flocks but not borders. The farmer, whose fields fed kings but whose sons were untrained, uncounted, unhonored. They watched from the sidelines, spectators in a war not meant for them. Their names would not be recorded. Their stories would not be sung. Their blood, if spilled, would be washed away by the next harvest, because war was not theirs to fight. A military built on class. This system, elegant in theory, disastrous in practice, stood for centuries. Battles were small, symbolic, and often indecisive. Armies were gathered not for strategy, but for spectacle. And the nobility, ruling both crown and conflict, assumed their divine right to dominate war just as they did land and law. But they had grown blind to the changing world, blind to the rising tide of unrest, blind to the strength gathering not in castles, but in cottages. And as the 14th century dawned, that blindness would be punished. The storm begins to shift. For the 100 Years' War was not a war like those that came before. It was not a brief campaign for reputation. It was a crucible, one that would melt the gilded armor of aristocracy and forge a new warrior from the clay of the common man. The knights would still ride, but they would no longer ride alone. The field of honor was about to be invaded, not by cowards or fools, but by heroes in rags. The coming revolution. Before the arrow pierced the sky at Crécy, before mud swallowed the hooves of chivalry at Agincourt, before the yeoman etched his mark into history, there was this moment, this final breath of the old world. A time when war still believed it belonged to the few. That illusion was about to be shattered, and from the ruins would rise a new truth, that courage knows no rank, that loyalty wears no silk, and that history in the end belongs not to those born noble, but to those who fight for the soul of a nation. The illusion of noble supremacy had cracked. The battlefield was no longer a tapestry for the vanity of lords. It had become a furnace, unforgiving, relentless, and vast. The 100 Years' War was not a knight's duel. It was a war of nations. And nations, unlike noble households, could not be defended by pageantry alone. Steel alone was not enough. What England needed now was discipline, endurance, and numbers. What it needed was a new kind of soldier. War without end. This was no seasonal raid, no border skirmish to settle dynastic pride. The war between England and France dragged on year after year, sapping treasuries, testing morale, and consuming men like fire consumes dry timber. Knights, once the vanguard of the army, were too few, too proud, too expensive. They were trained for shock, not siege, for spectacle, not survival. What England faced was a war of attrition, where battles were won not by flair, but by fatigue. And in such a war, the common man became indispensable. The call to arms. The crown turned to the countryside, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Every village became a recruiting ground. Every able-bodied man, a potential warrior, the bowman, the spearman, the foot soldier, they would be the new shield of England. They were not raised in velvet halls, but in barns and forges. They were not schooled in Latin, but in weather, hunger, and pain. And yet, when trained, when hardened, they became the backbone of a nation at war. Training the nation. A new system emerged, not of conscripts, but of contracts. The English crown began to fund retinues, small units of paid professional soldiers under local captains. This was not feudal obligation, it was service for coin, for cause, and for country. Training grounds replaced tournaments. Discipline replaced ceremony. Commanders began to value stamina over surname, accuracy over ancestry. Men who once hunted rabbits now learned to fell knights. Plowmen became pikemen, tanners became tacticians. The nation was at war, and so the nation became an army. The birth of the English soldier. And from this crucible, a new identity was forged. Not just Englishmen, but English soldiers. They were not mere bodies to fill the ranks. They were craftsmen of war, methodical, brutal, efficient. These were the men who would hold the line at Crécy, who would break the charge at Poitiers, who would humble the flower of French chivalry at Agincourt. They wore no gilded armor. Their names were seldom sung, but their actions would rewrite the story of English warfare forever. When war became work war, once the sport of nobles, had become a trade. It was sweat before glory, repetition before romance, endurance before victory. And in this trade, the common man, once overlooked, became master. He knew how to march. He knew how to dig trenches, pitch camp, shoot in volleys, withstand siege. He was not born to war, but he was forged by it. And unlike the noble who sought honor, he sought results. A kingdom in uniform. By the end of the 14th century, the English army no longer resembled a feudal parade. It was a machine, lethal, disciplined, proud. And its gears were turned not by dukes or barons, but by the hands of the common soldier. In this transformation, England did not merely gain an army, it gained a new kind of hero. One who wore leather instead of silk. One who marched in mud, not marble. One who knew that victory was not granted by birth, but earned by grit, unity, and fire. From the mud-soaked training fields of England came not just hardened men, but a weapon so simple, so unassuming, that no noble could have predicted the ruin it would bring. It was not forged in royal smithies. It bore no crest, no jeweled hilt, no blessing from any crown. It was made of yew, wood, not steel. A weapon of the forest, wielded by farmers, fletchers, and foresters. Yet in their hands, it would become the scourge of knighthood and the death knell of chivalric warfare. It was the English longbow, a tool of the commons, a weapon of kings. At first glance, the longbow was laughable to the elite. No knight would stoop to draw it. No noble would boast of it in song. But the English crown saw its worth. Because where the lance could fell one man, the longbow could fell 100. Its arrows flew farther than any crossbow bolt. Its rate of fire was unmatched, up to 10 shots a minute in the hands of a master. Its range, deadly at over 200 yards. Its penetration, capable of punching through armor from a distance that made cavalry charges irrelevant. It was a weapon of precision, terror, and volume. And most importantly, it was cheap. For the price of one knight's armor, England could arm and train a dozen archers. The breaking of chivalry. And so it began. In 1346, at the fields of Crécy, the flower of French nobility, arrayed in shimmering plate and atop powerful steeds, charged with the fury of centuries-old pride. They expected retreat. They expected surrender. Instead, they found themselves riding into a storm of arrows, descending like rain, blackening the sky. Wave after wave of armored cavalry was shattered by peasants with strings of twisted hemp and arrows feathered with goosequill. The longbowmen, trained from childhood, did not falter. They did not need armor. They needed only resolve and the strength of their draw. The French knights, symbols of an era, fell not by blade or lance, but by the will of the low-born and the curve of seasoned yew. A tactical earthquake. The longbow did not merely kill men. It killed ideas. It destroyed the illusion of invincible cavalry. It exposed the vulnerability of armor. It ended the notion that social class determined battlefield worth. At Poitiers and again at Agincourt, the lesson was repeated, louder each time. French knights, numerous, proud, overconfident, charged straight into their doom. Their horses slipped in mud. Their formations broke under arrow volleys. And when they reached the English line, if they reached it at all, they were already bled, broken, and beaten. A new warfare is born. The longbow was not just a weapon, it was a doctrine. Fire in volleys. Position on high ground. Use terrain to trap cavalry. Let the enemy come to you, and let them die on the way. No longer was warfare about individual valor. Now it was about coordination, training, and ranged supremacy. It was about armies, not heroes. It was about the commoner, not the count. And the English mastered it. The rise of the archer. To wield the longbow was to wield power once unthinkable for the low-born. These men were not side characters in war. They were its architects. And so the longbowman, once a woodsman, a shepherd, a hunter, became England's deadliest weapon. He did not need a title. He needed draw strength, discipline, and calm under pressure. And in return, he received something no war had ever given his kind before. Respect. The longbow had reshaped the battlefield. But it was the man behind the bow who reshaped history. From the shadows of the noble court, the common soldier had risen. Not by inheritance, but by merit. Not by rank, but by resolve. And now, across 3 legendary fields, that resolve would shake the foundations of medieval warfare. 1346. The Field of Crécy. It began at Crécy. A storm was coming. Thousands of French knights galloping with fury, banners snapping in the wind, convinced of easy victory. They faced a smaller, weary English army. Their enemy? A force of archers and footmen, mud-stained, exhausted, undersupplied. No match, surely, for the elite of France. And yet, when the charge began, the sky turned black. Volley after volley of arrows fell like iron rain, tearing through armor, blinding horses, splintering formations. The noble charge broke upon a wall of arrows and grit. English discipline triumphed. French pride shattered. And in that moment, the myth of knightly supremacy began to crumble. Crécy was not a duel of lords. It was a revolution from below. 1356. The Snare of Poitiers. 10 years later, the lesson had not yet been learned. At Poitiers, the French outnumbered the English again. They held the field, commanded cavalry, surrounded their enemy. But Edward, the Black Prince, wise beyond his years, trusted his archers and his infantry. They laid traps, chose ground, and stood firm. As the French charged, the same fate awaited them. Arrows rained down, horses panicked, formations collapsed. The English surged forward, not nobles, not champions, soldiers. Men of grit, not grandeur. When the smoke cleared, the King of France, Jean II, was a prisoner, captured not by a duke or knight, but by the relentless machine of trained ordinary men. Poitiers had proven it beyond doubt. Victory belonged to the professional, not the privileged. 1415. The Miracle of Agincourt. But it was at Agincourt that destiny itself bent toward the common man. On October 25th, 1415, King Henry V stood outnumbered and trapped. His army, exhausted, starving, sick. Before him, the largest assembly of French nobility in a generation. The field was a swamp. The night had rained. The ground clung to boots and hooves like a curse. And then the English took their positions, not in armor, but in discipline. The longbowmen planted their stakes, knocked their arrows, and waited. The French charged into mud, into chaos, into death. Trampled by their own horses, crushed by collapsing ranks, they fell before they even reached the line. And those who did meet the English met not polished knights, but soldiers who fought like stone, unyielding, silent, fatal. When the battle ended, thousands of French nobles lay dead, and the English their losses numbered in the hundreds. It was not a miracle. It was the work of men trained by hardship, united by discipline, and unshaken by fear. The new hero of England. From Crécy to Poitiers to Agincourt, the message was carved into blood and earth. The knight was no longer king of the battlefield. The hero now wore no title. He walked among the ranks. He drew the bow. He held the line. He was the English soldier. These victories were not flukes. They were the coming of age of a nation that had finally placed its faith in the hands of its people. A crown earned by many. And in return, the people earned something the nobility never expected: pride, honor, a place in history. From this point on, the myth of war would never be the same. No longer did greatness ride a horse. It walked in boots, from Crécy's blood-soaked earth to the mud of Agincourt. The path had been carved not by kings nor by heraldic lions, but by mud-crusted boots, worn hands, and silent courage. What began as necessity had become identity. What began as strategy had become legacy. The English common soldier, once nameless, faceless, voiceless, now stood tall among the figures of national pride, not merely as a tool of war, but as the very heart of the realm. No longer the shadow of the knight. For centuries the peasant had lived in the long shadow of the knight. He tilled land he did not own. He paid taxes to lords who barely knew his name. He fought wars he did not choose, and died deaths history did not record. But the 100 Years' War changed that balance forever. The bow in his hand had not only pierced French armor, it had shattered a social order. No longer could nobility claim a monopoly on courage. No longer could bloodlines dictate who was worthy of song. Now, courage was earned in formation, honor was forged in discipline, and heroism wore a simple tunic. A nation looks down and sees itself. After Agincourt, England did not simply celebrate its king, it celebrated its men. Ballads were sung not just of Henry, but of the yeoman who stood at his side. Poets did not write only of bloodlines, but of blisters, frozen fingers, and unshakable will. These were the stories the people recognized as their own. And so began a quiet revolution, not in Parliament, but in the English soul. For the first time, the soldier and the citizen were one, the banner of Englishness. The image of the archer, the footman, the dirt-smeared warrior became the living symbol of England itself. It was not the crown that marched into France, it was the baker, the shepherd, the blacksmith. And they did not return the same. They came back with pride, not arrogance, honor, not title, memory, not mythology. And in the hearts of the people they were etched not in marble, but in blood, sweat, and quiet nobility. These were men who had not asked for glory, but in their refusal to flee, in their ability to endure, they had become England's banner. A new kind of patriotism. This was the birth of something deeper than victory. It was the rise of a national soul, not based on kings or saints, but on the shared sacrifice of the ordinary. The peasant who once bowed before his lord now stood with shoulders squared. The archer who once feared the knight now walked beside him. War had demanded everything of them, and in return, it had given them something unimaginable. Recognition. The echo that never fades. Centuries have passed. The battlefields have grown silent. The names of kings may fade in the dust of time, but the memory of the English common soldier endures. He is not forgotten in ballads sung. He is not buried beneath titles. He is the anthem in the blood of the people, the quiet strength in every storm, the proof that greatness, once hidden in the shadows, can rise and rise again until it becomes the standard of a nation. For while kingdoms rose and fell and crowns slipped from bloodied hands, it was he, the nameless soldier, the quiet backbone of a nation, who carried something greater across the centuries. And through him, through their defiance, their endurance, their sacrifice, England found what could never be taken. The soul that could not be conquered. The banners would one day fall. The fortresses across the Channel would one day crumble. And the dreams of an English empire in France, grand, defiant, and once so close, would vanish into the fog of loss. But what the sword could not hold, the soul would not surrender. Though England would lose the land, she would win something far greater. In the ashes of war, she discovered herself. The price of the crown. By the mid-15th century, the tide had turned. France, once splintered, now surged with new unity. Rallied by the voice of a peasant girl turned martyr, and driven by a crown determined to reclaim every stone of its soil. One by one, English strongholds fell. Normandy, Gascony, Bordeaux, each a jewel torn from the crown. Even Calais, England's last outpost on French soil, stood on borrowed time. What had begun as a campaign of conquest was now a long retreat, drawn out, costly, and humbling. To some, it looked like defeat. But in truth, it was transformation. The real battlefield. For while swords clashed in France, a quieter, deeper war had been waged within England itself. Not for territory, not for thrones, but for belonging, for identity, for a sense of who the English truly were. And that battle, unlike those in Normandy, was won. Because war does not only forge empires, it forges nations. The making of Englishness. In the crucible of war, the English people, noble and common alike, had begun to see themselves not just as subjects of a king, but as members of a nation. They spoke a language now distinct from the French courtly tongue. They read poems not in Latin, but in the earthy rhythm of Chaucer's verse. They cheered for bowmen and yeomen, not just knights. They told stories of muddy fields, of silent heroes, of stubborn resistance. Their victories had not only reshaped borders, they had reshaped the soul. And so, when the armies came home, without Aquitaine, without Normandy, without glory, they came home to a land that finally felt like theirs, a nation grounded in the people. In the end, England would no longer be defined by her holdings in France. She would be defined by her own soil, her own language, her own people. She would stop gazing across the Channel for validation. She would start looking inward and upward. The very loss of empire became the seed of nationhood. The withdrawal from France made England whole, because through war she had discovered something the continent could not give her: a common history, a shared struggle, a unified voice. What was truly won, so yes, England lost a war, but in that loss she gained something greater than land. She gained a name, a story, a people who finally knew who they were, and that no army could take. No treaty could sign away, no surrender could stain. The battlefields of France may have echoed with retreat, but in the hearts of her people, England marched forward, triumphant, not by conquest, but by becoming herself. The war with France had ended. The final banners had been lowered, the soldiers returned home, and the maps redrawn. But something far more enduring had taken root, not in France's soil, but in England's soul. Though she had ceded castles and coasts, England stood taller than before, not as an empire of land, but as a kingdom of its own making. For it was not territory that defined her. It was the culture, language, discipline, and will of a people who had endured. The language of the land. At the start of the Hundred Years' War, England still spoke like a court in exile. French in the palace, Latin in the church, silence on the tongues of the poor. But by the war's end, that had changed. No longer was English the language of the uneducated. It had become the language of the people, the pulpit, the parliament. It was the language of archers who broke knights, of poets who immortalized their struggles, and of kings who would now address their people as one of them. This was no longer the England of borrowed words. It was the England of Geoffrey Chaucer, of sermons in the vernacular, of law in the tongue of the land. Language was no longer imposed. It was owned. Culture, carved by conflict. Alongside language, culture awakened. The 100 Years' War did not merely redraw boundaries, it redrew the imagination. Art no longer glorified saints and noble blood alone. It began to reflect the muddy boots of soldiers, the weary faces of widows, the iron resolve of a people who had endured siege, hunger, and heartbreak. The taverns told stories of Agincourt. The hearths whispered of distant sons who never returned. The minstrels sang not only of lords, but of lads with bows and iron hearts. This was the culture of survival and of shared pride. A military of the people. And then there was the army. Once the plaything of noblemen, war had become a national affair. Gone were the days when battle was a tournament for knights. In their place rose trained archers, disciplined foot soldiers, and hardened veterans. Men drawn from farms and towns, men who had stood side by side through cold and chaos, men who had proven that courage could be worn without a coat of arms. The English military became a mirror of its people. Not gilded, but grit-born. Not ceremonial, but effective. And with it, England learned a crucial truth. She did not need to look outward for strength. She had already forged it within. The spirit of sovereignty. Most of all, it was the spirit of independence that grew in the silence after battle. Having stood against France's might for over a century, having fought for every inch of land and meaning, the English no longer saw themselves as branches of a Norman tree. They saw themselves as a people rooted in their own soil, a kingdom that might bend, but would not bow, a people who had spoken through bows, ballots, and belief. The war had taught them the price of pride, but also the worth of self-determination, the legacy within. And so, as the final embers of the 100 Years' War cooled, England stood not as a broken conqueror, but as a hardened nation, forged not by the lands it had taken, but by the identity it had reclaimed. The tongue was now English. The army was now of the people. The stories were now their own, and the soul of England, was now sovereign. A kingdom had risen from the fire, her language reborn, her people hardened, her story retold in her own voice. And as the final echoes of war faded, so too did the last illusions of kinship with the continent. For though swords had once crossed the channel with ambition, by war's end, the channel had become a chasm, not of geography, but of identity. The break with France was not just political, it was psychological, cultural, final, from blood to distance. Once, England's nobility had spoken French as a birthright. The Norman conquest had stitched the English crown to French lands, and for centuries, the kings of England saw themselves as lords of two realms. They married into French dynasties. They governed lands across the Channel. They dreamt of thrones that stretched from Dover to the Loire. But dreams can become chains, and war is a forge that melts illusions. The 100 Years' War shattered the idea that England and France were bound by destiny. In its place rose a new truth. To be English was to be something different, something no longer tethered to the French crown. The wounds that liberated it was not diplomacy that severed the bond. It was blood, battle, and the long years of sacrifice. For over a century, the English had buried their sons in French soil. They had bled for lands that no longer loved them. They had raised banners in castles they would never keep, and at last they asked, for what? Not out of defeatism, but awakening. Not with shame, but with clarity. The war had revealed that France would never again be ours, and more importantly, we would never again want it to be. From foreign tongue to native voice. This transformation was etched most clearly in language. Where once Parliament debated in French, now it spoke in English. Where once kings issued proclamations in the language of Paris, now they addressed their people in the voice of London, of York, of the Shires. The people no longer needed a court translator to understand their monarch. They needed only their mother tongue. And with that shift came a deeper one. England stopped trying to be a second France. She chose to become her first self. The end of a continental illusion. Even the nobility, once loyal to the dream of a dual kingdom, began to turn inward. The burdens of defending foreign soil had become too great, the rewards too fleeting, the connection too strained. Castles in Normandy were now ruins, titles in Aquitaine meaningless, and with each lost fortress, England became less a shadow of France, and more a nation with a destiny of her own making. The final withdrawal from the continent did not feel like exile. It felt like release. A nation apart. By the end of the 15th century, the separation was not only complete, it was irreversible. No longer did England look to France for culture, for power, or for identity. She looked to her own fields, her own people, her own language. The Channel, once a bridge of empire, had become a moat of sovereignty, and within it, something ancient yet newborn had taken shape. A kingdom no longer bound by inheritance, but by choice. A people no longer half French, half English, but entirely themselves. The severing from France had been clean, final, and necessary. But it was not merely a parting of crowns. It was a transformation of self. In the shadow of war, beneath the banners of kings, something far deeper had taken root. England had grown up. No longer a realm stitched together by feudal loyalty, foreign marriage, and fragile oaths. She had become a nation forged by shared struggle, defined by common voice, and bound by a newly discovered sense of who she was. From feudal webs to national threads. At the dawn of the war, England had been a tapestry of barons, bishops, and regional lords. Power was local. Loyalties were fragile. The king reigned but often did not rule. And yet, through a century of conflict, that ancient order had been burned away, not with laws but with fire, not by decree but by necessity. For war is not kind to disunity. It demands central command, loyal forces, and coordinated vision. And so the king, once merely a symbol, became a sovereign in truth. Parliament, once ceremonial, became essential. The people, once subjects, became stakeholders in the realm's survival. The cracks that formed foundations. Ironically, the very pressures that could have shattered the kingdom strengthened it. Taxation to fund the war forced negotiations between monarch and parliament. Military failure exposed the weaknesses of feudal levies and raised the value of the professional soldier. Political instability demanded new mechanisms of governance, representation, and law. And in meeting these challenges, England laid the bricks of her future. She did not collapse under the strain. She stood taller because of it. A people who recognized themselves. And as the institutions matured, so did the people. They no longer saw themselves merely as villains, tenants, craftsmen, or lords. They saw themselves as English, bound not by local allegiances, but by a collective memory of war and resistance. Unified not by bloodlines, but by a common tongue, a shared grief, and a rising pride. It was not just the parliament that found a voice. It was the people. In churches, in alehouses, in markets. Their stories were no longer whispered in foreign tongues or buried beneath noble deeds. They were sung, written, and remembered. In English, for England. The end of childhood. The 100 Years' War had begun in the world of chivalry and feudal splendor, of jousts and heralds, of oaths sworn over goblets, of kings dreaming of ancestral claims. But it ended in the world of common men, of supply chains and gunpowder, of diplomacy and taxation, of the rising will of a people who had come to see themselves not as fragments under a throne, but as limbs of one body. England had lost much: territory, treasure, countless lives. But she had gained something immeasurable. She had gained coherence. She had gained identity. She had gained maturity. Not just a kingdom, now a nation. By war's end, England was no longer just a kingdom on a map. She was a story, a culture, a collective soul. She had stepped out of the long shadow of France, survived the crucible of war, and emerged not as the empire she once tried to be, but as the nation she was always meant to become, not defined by what she conquered, but by what she endured, not crowned by gold, but by unity, voice, and unbreakable memory. And so, as England emerged from the ashes of war, more unified, more defined, more resolute, a deeper transformation took place, not in the halls of power, but in the heart of memory. For nations are not built by blood alone. They are built by the stories they choose to remember, and the meaning they make of suffering. England had matured, yes, but now came the most sacred act of all: to remember, to carry, to mythologize. From chronicle to legend, the 100 Years' War was not forgotten. It was immortalized, not as a mere sequence of dates and treaties, but as a vast epic etched into the bones of the people. The names of battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, no longer marked places on a map. They became symbols of courage, of defiance, of the common archer who toppled the noble knight. The faces of kings, Edward III, Henry VIII, became icons. Not just rulers, but storytellers of national greatness. Even the defeats were not buried in shame. They were woven into the myth, proof not of weakness, but of resilience. A mirror, held to the nation. The war had become a mirror, reflecting back not just suffering, but meaning. It told the English people what they had endured. It told them who they had become. It said, "You were peasants. Now you are patriots. You were divided. Now you are one. You were ruled. Now you believe." The war did not end when the last arrow flew. It lived on in ballads, parliamentary oaths, painted glass, sermons, and street plays. And most of all, it lived in memory, woven into the English soul. It would be told from hearth to hearth, from generation to generation, not with bitterness, but with reverence. Children would grow up not knowing Aquitaine, but knowing the valor of their ancestors. Not memorizing treaties, but singing of the bowmen who stood in rain and mud and made kings tremble. This was no longer history. This was inheritance. The birth of national memory. Other nations have myths of origin. Rome with Romulus and Remus, France with Charlemagne, Greece with Marathon. But England found her myth not in founding, but in fighting. Her story was not of birth, but of becoming, of claiming identity not from a single day, but from a century of trial, of tears, of triumph hard won, a war that never truly ended. And so, even as treaties were signed and borders drawn, the 100 Years' War never truly ended. It remained in every church where English was now spoken, in every soldier's tomb carved with pride, in every parliament session echoing with the voice of the people. It lived in the language. It breathed in the ballads. It marched in the heart of every Englishman who, centuries later, would still look back and say, "We were shaped there. We bled there. And in bleeding, we became. Thus ended the longest war. Not with silence, but with story. And in that story, a nation was born. But the tale does not end at the closing of treaties or the silence of the battlefield. For what the 100 Years' War truly gave England was not something that could be measured in territory or treaties. The war did not give her a throne in France. It did not deliver crowns or castles, nor did it leave her with the riches of empire. What it gave her was something less tangible, but infinitely more enduring. It gave her a soul. What began as a royal feud became the crucible in which a fragmented feudal realm was melted down and reforged into a nation. Through loss, she gained memory. Through blood, she found voice. And through struggle, she earned identity, what the 100 Years' War truly gave England. The 100 Years' War did not give England a throne in France. It did not deliver crowns or castles, nor did it leave her with the riches of empire. What it gave her was something less tangible, but infinitely more enduring. It gave her a soul. What began as a royal feud became the crucible in which a fragmented feudal realm was melted down and reforged into a nation. Through loss, she gained memory. Through blood, she found voice. And through struggle, she earned identity. From thrones to thoughts, England entered the war clinging to a claim, a king's right through a mother's blood, a legal argument sharpened into a sword. But in trying to conquer France, she confronted herself. And what she discovered was not a destiny across the Channel, but a truth buried deep in her own soil. That she was no longer a vassal kingdom. No longer a footnote to French ambition, no longer defined by what she had once borrowed. Not language, not culture, not war. A nation of many. From the ashes of feudal arrogance rose a new England, not ruled only by kings and knights, but carried forward by archers, merchants, farmers, and poets. Men who once had no voice became the chorus of the nation. Women who once prayed in Latin heard English in church for the first time. Children who had never seen a battlefield grew up chanting the names of victories and legends. The war belonged not just to the noble few. It belonged to the many, to those who bled, who worked, who believed. A language reclaimed, a story retold, and in that long twilight of conflict, the English tongue, once exiled from courts and scrolls, rose again, not as rebellion, but as revelation. It was the sound of sermons, the language of law, the ink of Chaucer and Gower, the rhythm of rising pride. No longer would Englishmen need to speak like foreigners to be heard. No longer would Latin veil the laws of their land. No longer would France be the mirror by which they judged themselves. They had become their own reflection. Beyond the battlefield. The war taught England more than strategy. It taught her who she was when the banners fell. Not a kingdom chasing ancient claims, not a noble dream of empire, but a people bound by memory, voice, and will. The victories at Crécy and Agincourt were not just military triumphs. They were symbols of a turning world where common men could shape the fate of nations, and longbows could shatter centuries of armored tradition. The legacy that endures. When the final treaty was signed, when the last soldier crossed the Channel, England may have walked away with less land. But she carried back something immeasurable. A language reborn. A people awakened. A nation no longer borrowed, but built. From war came wounds. From wounds came stories. And from those stories came England. Not the England of conquest, but the England of consciousness. Not an empire over others, but a nation unto herself. This is what the 100 Years' War truly gave her. Not glory in France, but the fire that lit her soul. A land transformed by pain, yet remembered in pride. Not just history, but identity.